Hi, Chief McLeod.
Anin, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I am fine, thanks.
Good. So thank you very much for joining us. Everyone, the audience is here. They can hear you well. If there's any questions, uh, they'll ask the questions at the question podium, and you'll be able to hear them quite clearly. So take it away.
Miigwech, Anin Kinoya, Zongabwe Dijnakas, Bizing Junjaba. My name is Chief McLeod, and I'm the current chief of Nipissing First Nation. First of all, I have to apologize. I'm coming from the Anishinaabe Grand Council in Thunder Bay, and so I had to come back to my hotel room to join you virtually. But I don't have a formal presentation, but I've talked about this so much that it's pretty always fresh in my mind as to things that we're doing at Nipissing in regards to sustainability from an Indigenous perspective. So I want to start off by just giving a little bit of history about Nipissing First Nation, because to understand where we're at today with regards to sustainable resources, you have to understand how we got here. So and it's been a long road for most First Nations in Canada, and a lot of our stories are similar. So to start off, Nipissing First Nation, which is located right, just west of Canadore. We've been on the lands and territories of Lake Nipissing for time immemorial. We've found artifacts of our nation that date back in excess of 8,000 years. So when you put that in perspective to European culture and Western culture, we date back before the times of the Great Pyramids and the Jesus Christ himself and the story of in the Bible. Our history goes back well beyond that. And our connection to the territory and the land is very unique, and it's very spiritual in nature, and also we've been dependent upon it for our existence for a long time, and we continue that dependency today. So just to flash forward a bit, when things were starting to get established as far as colonization in this country. And I'll speak mostly about the British, because ultimately that's who occupied our territories. They in around 1763, I think it was, the British made a declaration, the Royal Proclamation, which wasn't a treaty, but it set out the rules or the laws that the British were to follow when dealing with Indigenous people in this country. And it set the stage for the treaties that were to come. And one of the most notable treaties that followed that was the Treaty of Niagara, which the British had were able to bring in a lot of nations from the Great Lakes Basin to come in and talk about this treaty making process and how the treaties were going to be made to share the land. And it was the treaty that really joined the British and the Indigenous people together by commitments, and they're displayed in wampum belts of that time, the two-row wampum, which is probably the most significant treaty that led on to further treaties as time went on. But in that two-row wampum, it described how Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people were going to live together, but never intersect. So the two-row wampum was actually 2 rows of wampum beads that never touched each other, but they were close. And that was significant in the fact that our relationship was never to interfere with the other, and that we would live in harmony and balance. So from that treaty, there were subsequent treaties that followed, all of which were viewed from the Indigenous lens as not replacing the Treaty of Niagara, but adding on to the treaty as an addendum or a continuance of the relationship. Because from the Indigenous perspective, relationships were not static in nature, and so every few years you would revisit and discuss the things that need to be changed or improved upon. And so subsequent treaties followed, and 2 of them, which are more pertinent to my discussion here, were the 1850 Robinson-Huron Treaty and the Robinson-Superior Treaty, which are actually the same treaty, but just for sake of getting together and making it more functional, it was divided into 2 meetings, but essentially the treaties were word for word, and they were encompassing the same topics that were on the either treaty. So Nipissing was located within the encatchment for the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. So in 1850, the chief of Nipissing at the time, which is Shabgijik, made his way to Bouting, which is now known as Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, to gather with the other 21 communities or nations to sign what's known still today as the Robinson-Huron Treaty. So again, that treaty was viewed as a continuance of the commitments of the relationship between the Crown and our nations. And up until that point, there was a lot of movement by the Crown to take up more resources. There was a lot of exploration and mining that was starting, and the chiefs at the time knew they had to revisit that original treaty of Niagara to add on to the more protections and more assurity of protecting our inherent way of living and governing ourselves. And that's an important point to take, is that when you hear of treaties today, when you hear of issues that arise, it's always referred to as a battle of treaty rights, and that really is misleading in nature, that term treaty rights, because treaty rights make it sound as if First Nations people got their rights from a treaty. And actually, we had our rights, our inherent rights, and that's an important term, prior to any treaty, even prior to the Treaty of Niagara and the Royal Proclamation. So our rights existed already, and the treaties were a way of protecting those rights. So to call them treaty rights is misleading, and it again strengthens the thought that the Crown was so gracious that they gave us these rights through a treaty process, and this is something that was given to us. But in fact, from the Indigenous lens, it's their inherent rights that were given to us by creation. So there's a big difference there in the mentality. So in 1850, after signing the treaty, which protected many things, including our governance, our language, our culture, our way of harvesting, our use of our lands, education, health, all those things were encompassed in this treaty to protect those things, and to also share the wealth, which was what Britain was after, of our resources. So we agreed that we would share, but again, going back to the spirit and intent of the two-row wampum, we wanted to make sure that our interests never impacted each other, and that we remained living in harmony as nations. And there was lots of resources that could be shared, but it was under conditions, and those conditions were laid out in the treaty. So we went through the motions of having signed that treaty, and I use that term quite pointedly, because the Indigenous people still believed in the treaty and the treaty process and the spirit and intent. But in hindsight, it was just going through motions from the Crown's side of things, because they were essentially, checking off the boxes that what they had to do, what their laws said about the treaty process, with no real intention, as it turns out, of living up to those terms and conditions. So shortly after 1850, in 1867, we all know what happened then, and the British North American Act was signed between Britain and the new colonies in what's now known as Canada. But it's important to know that the only document up until that point was the treaty that protected our inherent rights. And so I'm still not sure, and I still ask those questions of, how Indigenous people got Canadian citizenship, when the British North American Act was not between Indigenous people. It was actually between the colonizers and the British Crown, to separate and create the Dominion of Canada. So in 1867, the still only document that was capturing our relationship was the treaty at that time. But shortly after, once Canada started to create their government system, they passed in 1876 the Indian Act. And again, the only document that we agreed to, the only document that was signed by Anishinaabe people, was that treaty. But yet the piece of legislation known as the Indian Act was unilaterally imposed upon Indigenous people. We didn't agree to it. We didn't sign anything. At that point, I guess that's where we became Canadian citizens. I'm still not clear on how we're identified as Canadian when we are our own nations, and not to be facetious or not show pride in this country, but it's just the factual events and legal events that lead us to our relationship today is what I'm speaking about. So with the Indian Act, I'm sure many of you know what came of that. All the things that the treaty represented as far as protecting our inherent rights, such as self-government, such as ceremony, culture, education, that was all taken away from us and replaced with Indian Act approved band councils. It was replaced with Indian residential schools. We weren't allowed to practice our culture. Our language was lost because we couldn't speak our languages. We went from my grandmother, who was born in 1894, who was fluent in Anishinaabe-Moin, our language, to my dad, who spoke both languages, to myself, who only speaks English now and is trying to learn Anishinaabe-Moin. That's how quickly our language was lost to the legislation and the government of Canada. So it was very impactful to our community. I'm not going to, get into all the atrocities and social problems that became or were a result of the Indian Act. But needless to say, part of that was our ability to access the land and resources. We weren't allowed to. And so for the next 150 years, we were marginalized from doing the things that we were always in habit of doing, which was living off the land, using fish and game and other natural resources as a commodity for trade. We were a very vibrant trading community. That was all taken away from us. It was replaced with a lot of poverty in our community, not being able to access the lake that was right in front of us, that had helped us survive for in excess of 10,000 years. We weren't allowed to trade anymore or sell any of the products that we got from the lake, and we were quite known as a very busy fishing community. So all that was taken from us, and it was replaced with the non-Indigenous desire to exploit resources and make money and start an economy, while we were sidelined and forced to live in poverty situations with not much employment opportunities other than very basic menial jobs that were provided to our community. That obviously led to social problems, alcohol abuse, and many other things that came. So we went through a very dark period for the next few decades. So the in the 50s and 60s, and I'll now just turn focus on Lake Nipissing. By the 50s and 60s, the non-Indigenous people realized the value of a sport fishery and a commercial fishery. So they were exploiting it and essentially attracting the entire world to come and fish in the waters of Lake Nipissing for the trophy walleye and also some of the commercial valued species, to a point where the fishery was booming, but was also being impacted heavily on fishing pressure. By the 1970s, our community started to fight back. We started to get a little more educated on the treaty itself and our rights that were protected under the treaty, and what the interpretation of the treaty that was signed. And we started to push back, and at first there was a lot of controversy. We were getting charged. We were forced to fish under the cloak of darkness, and I remember growing up as a young boy, and hearing the stories of game wardens that were chasing our fisher people that were going out, and these are just small boats. They're not commercial size vessels by any means, and it was also grandmothers and aunties and uncles and my father and many other men in the community that chose to try to eke out a meager living. And you have to really understand that this was the main staple of our community for centuries, for millennia. And we were fighting just to have a little piece of that by the 70s. Fishing pressure started to increase because now, we have Indigenous fishermen going out and setting nets. You have the commercial fishing, the angling sport fishery that is booming. All to say, it came to a head in about 1990 when the ministry put together a sting operation in our community. Mike Harris being the Minister of Natural Resources at the time, which kind of gives you a little background or how Indigenous people feel about some of the namesakes and honors that Mr. Harris has received in our territory, when he's honestly looked by the Indigenous view as essentially an enemy to our community for some of the past dealings that we had. So in 1990, as a result of all these charges, they had helicopters surveilling our community. They had cameras on the telephone posts. They had undercover conservation officers purchasing fish from our families, all to build their case. And it went to before the courts, and subsequently we won the case. We successfully argued that we had a commercial right to access the resources in Lake Nipissing based on our historic and treaty that was signed in 1850 that protected our way of living, and so we won. And unfortunately, things didn't really change. We were continually being harassed, and a lot of negative pressure from the outside communities about our activity of trying to get back into the fishery. And but there was also a few other cases that were happening across the country, one in particular, which was the Sparrow case. And that was a case out of British Columbia, which wasn't so much the decision itself, but there was a bit of a caveat to the ruling, which was in favor of Sparrow. And in that, the judge went on to say or to place a priority on the resources. So in the decision, it said that the priority one, the most paramount priority, is the resource itself and the management of it, which makes total sense. Secondly was Indigenous access to sustenance and ceremonial purposes. The third was Indigenous access to commercial fishing, or commercial, in this case it was fishing. And then after that came the non-Indigenous recreation, and then the non-Indigenous commercial. And those were the priority allocations that were set in that case. So we used that to strengthen our position. And as we got closer to the year 2000, the government, Ontario, started to realize that this was a losing battle, and they started to try to work with us. And one of the ways that they did was to offer us a ACFL, which was an Aboriginal community fishing license to commercially fish. We refused, in the simple fact that if we were to accept them as the licensor and us as the licensee, we would be admitting that they had jurisdiction over what we did and how we did it. So we elected to create our own fisheries department and start working on fisheries law, because what we knew was that also in that Sparrow ruling was that if the First Nations were not didn't have the capacity to manage the resource sustainably, that it would be turned back to or defaulted back to the province to manage. So we essentially needed to create these laws, or everything was just going to go back to the way it was, which was the ministry being in charge of our fishing and telling us how to do it and when we can do it. And we didn't want that, but we knew that it had to be managed responsibly. So we started to create these laws. And by 2004, we had ratified these laws with our community, who all agreed that we wanted to have a fishery that was well managed and sustainable, and that would provide for generations to come. So that was an easy thing to do, right? So in 2004, we passed those, but we quickly realized that when you make laws, you have to have the capacity to enforce them. Otherwise, the laws will set you back further than if you didn't even have a law. And so what we realized was we won the case, and we won our right to access the fishery, and that the ministry couldn't charge us for doing those. But we also realized that when the Indian Act of 1876 was imposed on us, it really limited our ability under that act to be able to create laws to govern our own members off the reserve. And so the Lake Nipissing is attached to our reserve, but it's not considered reserve under the law of Canada. It's not lands reserved for Indigenous people. So therefore it's off reserve. Therefore, under Canadian law, our authority to create any laws were handcuffed. So as you can see, what's happening now is that the Canadian law system had created a void of law. It was like an area of lawlessness where the province couldn't interfere with our fishermen, but neither could our government. And so the fishermen continued to go out and just fish as they pleased without following rules. And it wasn't, when I say they didn't follow rules, it makes them sound like bad people, but you have to really put in perspective that these fishermen were not allowed access and essentially starved from any ability to access the resources or make any money or provide any food for over 100 years. So for them to go out and just fish and do what they want to do was quite understandable under those conditions. Not necessarily right, but understandable. And so we had to get creative. Now we have, the right to fish, but we don't have a mechanism in place to actually provide laws or boundaries as to how much fish and make sure that we had sustainable management on the lake. So by 2010, we got into discussions with the Ministry of Natural Resources, and we said, look, we're not going to take a license under under the province jurisdiction. We're just not going to do that. And their point was, well, how do we do this if you're not going to do that, if you're not going to let us charge them? And so we came up with the idea of taking our fishing laws and attaching or amending them to the provincial law. So now our laws are passed under the provincial regulation in their law system that recognizes those rights, right? And so we signed a memorandum of understanding to acknowledge each other's jurisdiction, to acknowledge each other's responsibilities to management and to their people on both sides, And then we took those laws, amended them to provincial laws. So now we had two systems that have the same laws in them. And how this was going to work was that we went back to our members and said, look, we have laws here and we have our own adjudication process to those laws. So if you have infractions of our law, you're called to a compliance meeting to talk about what you're being charged with, and to choose your plea, and then face a circle of peers from our community to argue or to defend your actions, right? So and that's very powerful, like to have to stand up to your community peers. This is not just paying a fine in the mail, or you pay your $150 and then be on your way. You actually have to face members in your community and own up to what it was that you've been doing, and realize again that these laws were sanctioned by the community. They wanted these laws. So it sounds very soft, but when you actually are in that process, it's a very difficult process to be judged by your community and live with them every day afterwards. So there was that system. And then there was the system of the province, who now had their laws, our laws, incorporated into their laws. So now we simply talked to our fishermen and said, look, you have to make a decision. Are you part of our community? Are you part of their community? There's no more lawless, in between. You have to make a choice. So if it had an infraction, they would follow our laws and say, okay, what do I have to do? And they would, make amends to correct what they did. And that might be donating fish to the community or to the food bank or to elders, that kind of thing. And you might lose your fishing privileges for a certain amount of time. Or if you said, you know what, I don't believe in your laws, I don't think you have the power to do anything against me, you can't make me come to the circle, then we'd say, okay. And then we would talk to the ministry and say, look, they're not following our laws, they're not following what our community wants, they're not part of our community in this respect, so you deal with them. So then the ministry would charge them. And their argument was, well, you can't do that, you're infringing on our treaty rights, and they would use that term. And they would come back to us, and we would, our council and myself would say, well, no, you're not following our inherent rights. Give us the power to create laws for the betterment of our community. We do have individual rights within our community, within our nation, but they do not supersede the rights of the collective. In other words, one single person cannot infringe on the entire community's right. You're protected and you have individual rights under that umbrella, but you do not supersede that. And if you feel like you do, then you're not part of our community. Now you're subject to the outside community. And so it went, there was, I believe, 7 proponents who initially tried to fight that and go based on just their own personal rights. And it was essentially dismissed from court because our community was loud and clear that these rights of our community are going to be protected. And as commercial fishermen, you do have the protection. Your rights are protected, but only under our laws and our way of managing our fishery and accessing the resources. And that's how it's always been done for time. And so we're getting back to the way that we were prior to contact, which means that if you were part of our community, 800 years ago, you weren't allowed to jeopardize the lives of the rest of the community by going out and doing actions that the community didn't want you to do. You would be ostracized or worse back then. So those laws have been around forever, and it took over 150 years of losing that jurisdiction to finally regain our place in governing our own people and protecting the resources. Subsequently, since 2015, and I didn't talk too much about the fishery itself, but by then it was on the verge of collapse, the walleye fishery, which was difficult to explain to the fishermen because they were catching lots of fish. But it was similar to the Atlantic salmon stocks on the East Coast back in the 90s, because the stocks are, I think it was, I don't know if it was the salmon or the cod, but anyway, they had the same issue there. They were catching lots of fish, but the problem was the fish that they were catching were smaller of size and they weren't reaching sexual maturity to reproduce. And so this was happening on Lake Nipissing. There was lots of fish because it was preceded by some really good spawning years. But the adults were harvested afterwards, and the only thing left was immature fish that were just coming into the fishery, but not reaching sexual maturity. So we were essentially, even though there was lots of fish, we were cutting them off before they could actually reach the spawning age. So there was no recruitment back into the system. So it would be like, spending money in your bank account, but not getting any interest. Eventually your bank account's going to crash. And that's what we were seeing with the walleye. So in 2015 is when we got the memorandum of understanding signed with the ministry, and we put this all into works. And it was a very rough period for us for the first 5 years of adjusting, our fishermen adjusting to these rules, because remember they were left out of the fishery for decades, and now they were going back into another set of rules, which was not very palatable for them at the time, even though it was our own rules. But essentially we diverted the crash. We have since improved the fishery with our management system that we have in place, and we work with the Ministry of Natural Resources. We meet quite frequently to discuss those issues on whether it be the sustainable management or the harvesting, the allocations, those kinds of things. We work out with them, and it's been going well since then. I still get the odd, criticism of why we have to work with the ministry. And excuse me, it's quite simple that, there's only one fishery. And if we think back to the two-row wampum, we have to really understand that, we're both reliant on that fishery. And so we both need to step up and make sure that it's managed responsibly. Sorry, I'm getting dry here. I'm just going to get a water. So at the end of the day, I tell our members that I would sooner be arguing about the allocation of a healthy lake than arguing about who gets the last fish. So they understand that. The vast majority of our community supports what we're doing, as well as a lot of the non-natives. And also, excuse me, also the ministry obviously is working with us because they have a responsibility to manage the lake. And there's two governing bodies, so we have to work together in order to ensure proper management. So we support each other. We collect data together. And we interpret that data. And yes, we argue about the data and we argue about allocation, but that's just the politics of managing a healthy fishery. And as I said, that's I'd rather be arguing about allocation of a healthier fishery than arguing about who gets the last fish, which nobody wins in that scenario. So that's basically it in a nutshell. I glossed over quite a few things, but if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to try to answer them for you. So miigwech for listening.
Thank you so much, Chief McLeod, for joining us. I understand today's probably quite a busy day for you. So before we let him get back to his day, does anyone have any questions? All right, Chief McLeod, it looks like, oh, okay. Sorry, that's the media crew. It looks like you are off the hook. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Take care.
Miigwech for having me.